good evening, afternoon, or morning to all of you, and welcome to another Adam Smith Institute webinar. I'm Morgan Schondelmeier, Head of External Affairs at the ASI, and I'm thrilled to be bringing you another discussion on the exciting political landscape of my homeland, the United States. This time we'll be covering President Biden's brand new administration and his first 100 days in office. The first 100 days in office often serve as a bellwether for the years to come, giving insight into an administration's operating style and policy priorities. While we're only a few days in, Biden has already been busying himself with executive orders, cabinet appointments, and shaping his agenda. Franklin Delano Roosevelt coined the term first 100 days and had a very active first 100 days. He passed 76 laws and 99 executive orders. Of course, that was the era of extra big government, and it's a bit harder to pass legislation nowadays, but we'll have to wait and see how Biden will compare. And as a British think tank, we wonder how the US will approach the oft-touted special relationship with the UK, especially now that the UK is branching out on her own. Is the special relationship so special after all? To cover this and more, I'm so pleased to welcome my expert panel. First, we welcome Freddy Gray, the editor of the Spectator USA and deputy editor of the Spectator. He also hosts the Spectator's Americano podcast, which specializes in American politics. We also have Joseph C. Sternberg of the Wall Street Journal. He is the editorial page editor and political economics columnist for the journal's European edition. And finally, reprising his role as an ASI webinar guest is Douglas Carswell, the brand new president and CEO of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. He was formerly an MP, co-founder of the Vote Leave campaign, and government advisor. So first, I'll invite my guests to give us a brief introduction to the discussion as they tell us what they expect for the next 100 days. Then we'll move on to a chaired discussion followed by audience Q&A. You can always submit your questions below using the Q&A function. So if we'll go to Freddie first for his introductory statements.
Hello, I'm just unmuting myself, hope that works. Can you hear me? Hello, Morgan, thank you very much for inviting me on here. Great honor. I think I'd like to talk about whether the Biden administration is an Obama reboot, because it's been a sort of fairly lazy, I suppose, line that journalists like me have used a lot about what a Biden administration would look like, was to say it would just be a sort of reversion to the Obama years and a deletion of the Trump years. And I think in the first few days, you've seen a little bit of that, but it's also a considerably more ambitious administration in interesting ways. And I would say a considerably worse, or it looks like it might be a considerably worse administration. And I don't think the Obama administration was a particularly bad one, but I fear that the Biden administration will be considerably worse. And you mentioned FDR in the 100 days. And I feel that what we're seeing with the Biden administration might be that it's a sort of zombie FDR administration. A lot of people have hyped him up as potentially somebody who, although underrated, may turn out to be this great healing statesman. And certainly in his speech, he talked about unity. He talked a lot about unity. But I think for the Democrats, and Biden has imbibed a lot of this thinking, unity does not mean political unity. It means talking about unity while demonizing large sections of the population, particularly people who may have voted for Donald Trump. And when I talk about their ambition, I'm talking about things like House Resolution 1, which is the incoming legislation, which involves a lot of pandemic response stuff, but also an attempt to make all elections like elections in California, to kind of federalize mail-in voting on a massive scale, which would mean that Republicans can no longer win elections. I don't know what your listeners will think about that, but I think, I don't know what your listeners will think about whether mail-in voting is fair, but I think we can probably agree that it is open to fraud. I'm not going to get into whether the last election was stolen. I don't think it was, but I do think the mass expansion of mail-in voting is a cause for concern in all democracies, and there's a reason why some democracies don't allow it. And I think this is a fairly naked and ambitious push by Pelosi and the Democrats to gerrymander elections, so it'll be very hard for Republicans to win again in the future. And I think on that point, the reason why this administration might be quite successful in its strangely zombie way is that it doesn't have an effective opposition. And we've seen in Britain what can happen when political parties don't have effective opposition, when governments don't have effective oppositions. They tend to become quite incompetent. And I think that if the Republican Party is facing a kind of schism from Donald Trump, as it may do, possibly with the emergence of the Patriot Party, then it's not going to be in a very strong position to resist, even if it wins back, say, the House in the midterms. It's not going to be in a very strong position to resist a lot of legislation that could just be, or seems to be a lot of the legislation so far. It's very much signaling legislation, about trans rights, or there'll be a lot of stuff about climate change. And I think COP28 is going to be this big moment in the Biden presidency. And certainly, I know with Britain and Brexit, a lot of people are concerned about the relationship between Biden and Brexit. But I think a lot of British politicians are hopeful that with COP28 and climate change, they can come to some sort of agreement where they both realise that they're good guys who want to fight climate change. I think there's a lot of excessive hope there. I don't think the Biden administration is very fond of Britain. Yes, there are realities that can't be ignored, and we are old allies and so on. But I think the mood music is not good as far as we're concerned, as far as Britain is concerned. So that would be my sort of fairly rambling summary. I think zombie woke neoliberalism at home, a reversion to Obama policies abroad, and a fairly unfriendly tone, if not reality, towards Brexit.
Thank you. I really, there's a few things I definitely want to touch on later. I've worked them into a question about Republican working together with Democrats on legislation, but also Biden kind of having to bring together all these different Democratic factions as well. So there's quite a lot of factionalism within the parties, never mind between the parties. So I think I'd like to touch on that later. Let's bring in Joe for his introductory statements and see where that gets us. I'd be really interested to hear Joe's approach, maybe from the European side. Joe is, like myself, an American abroad. So welcome, Joe.
Yeah, well, thanks, Morgan, and thanks to the Adam Smith Institute for organizing this kind of event and inviting me along for this one. I always really enjoy, doing this sort of thing, and I want to pick up on a couple of strands actually from Freddy's introduction, but then really, sort of draw those out to talk a bit about the kind of economic policy that I'm expecting from Biden, especially early on. Because I think that actually it is going to be on the economy that we will see a lot of very aggressive action from the new Biden administration very early. And I would agree with Freddy's assessment that this will probably go a bit further than what you would expect if you were just looking for a simple reprise of the Obama era. And I think that one, the way that this quick action is going to manifest itself, we're already seeing with this slew of executive orders that have come out over the past week on everything from various immigration matters to there's now talk about doing a beefed up Buy American provision for government procurement, which has major implications for trade policy. I think that you're going to shortly see a lot of executive action that is really going to reduce the scope for fracking and other energy extraction within the U.S. We saw an very early move to try to kill the Keystone XL pipeline that would run from Canada down to the Gulf Coast. And a couple of things are happening here. I mean, one thing is that this is all so much more aggressive in a way than I seem to recall us seeing during the Obama administration. I mean, early on when Obama came in early 2009, it was very similar today. There was this preoccupation with a major economic crisis that the new president had inherited, and a lot of demand for very fast action on that. But I think that really, if you look at the Obama first term in particular in whole, the thing that we remember is the Affordable Care Act, which was a major piece of economic legislation. But it was also something that it took a long time for them to do, relatively speaking. It took them more than a year, and coming up with some way of pushing that through Congress to legislate. And what I'm already detecting this time around is even more haste than we saw from Obama in 2009, and even less willingness to go through the Congress. I think that what they seem to have learned from their experience during the Obama years is exactly how much they think they can get done with this phone and a pen that Obama used to always talk about as a metaphor for his ability to use executive orders and other administrative action to implement policies when the legislature wouldn't. So I think that that means that you're going to see a lot of progressive governance unconstrained, especially early in the term when the Congress is still getting itself organized. And this is going to have a lot of implications. I mean, this is going to have implications for a lot of these regulatory issues that I've mentioned. I think that you're going to see them try much faster out of the gate to get huge spending legislation through Congress once they think they're in a position to do that. And they will find procedural mechanisms to do that with unconstrained by having to find more Republican support in the Senate than they might otherwise want to do. I think that on some of the trade stuff, it will actually look very much like what we had under Trump. I mean, things like this Buy American provision that Biden is talking about. But it will be in a way much better organized than it was under Trump, because we're going to be seeing the working out of a coherent ideological program from the progressive left, in contrast to the sheer chaos that we often saw in the Trump administration. And you're going to see a lot of regulatory issues on energy. I mean, one contrast with Obama, and this is really the last point I would make in the introduction, what's striking, even barely a week into the Biden administration, is that when Obama sought to remake a huge portion of the US economy, the healthcare sector, he felt constrained to go through Congress and legislate to do that. And the result was the long grinding controversy over the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, that really only came to fruition more than a year after he had taken office. I think there is now a progressive agenda to remake another large portion of the American economy, energy, under the guise of green policy making, but they seem to be more willing to do that through executive action, even without recourse to go to the legislature, which they will eventually have to do if they want to push through a big Green New Deal. So I'm seeing an awful lot of activity. I'm seeing a lot of quick moves to act on a lot of these progressive policy priorities that have been stewing for a long time. And I'm seeing a tendency to do that at the expense of any of the traditional efforts to go through the Congress, which will have some interesting and probably troubling political impacts in terms of their ability to build long-term support or kind of quell any of these deeper political fissures that we have right now. So I'm going to kind of leave it there, but that would be my opening shot.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one as well. One thing that you mentioned about using executive orders as opposed to going through legislatures, it makes me think of any sort of barriers we might encounter with the Supreme Court, which of course would be kind of opposed to these sort of large state measures by decree. So I think I'd like to touch on that later if we could, because that is one of the Trump legacies that will directly impact Biden's ability to govern. Let's bring in our last guest, Douglas, for his introductory thoughts, and then we will bring back all of our guests for our chaired discussion.
Morgan, it's wonderful to be talking to you at this ASI webinar, and it's even better to be doing so from Mississippi. I think what is now in the balance is nothing less than the future of American exceptionalism. America has historically been a very successful country because it has had a relatively limited system of government, relatively low taxes, and a relatively big and prosperous and unconstrained civic society and private economy. And I think what we see in the Biden administration is not just a radicalized Democrat party in charge of the federal government, but a radicalized Democrat party that has relatively few constraints on it. Now, if you go back in time, you see attempts by Wilson and FDR and others to impose what you might call a progressive agenda. The current administration is, I think, a world away from traditional big state Democrats. The current administration, I think, has an agenda that is far more radicalized. Don't think of this as being the Joe Biden administration. Think of it as the Pelosi administration. A lot of very sort of radical, wokey ideas that will have all sorts of implications for things like energy costs with climate change rules, all sorts of implications on free trade, all sorts of implications on the global economy if they're serious about protectionist procurement measures. It's also going to have some pretty big implications on American civic society, because I think there is this streak of intolerance amongst this radicalized Democrat faction that now controls that party. So I think what we're going to see is some really quite disturbing big government initiatives that will, I think, remind a lot of people who voted Democrat that they didn't so much vote for any of this, and they perhaps didn't necessarily vote for Biden. They were voting against the other guy. And I suspect that that's going to become quite apparent in the opinion polls very soon. For example, the current administration has in effect signed executive orders which mean that the United States is no longer in the business of deporting people. That's going to have huge consequences. If you no longer deport people as a country, then you don't in effect have a lawful means for deciding who does and who doesn't come in, because if you're not willing to enforce the rules on who doesn't qualify, the logic of your migration system breaks down. So there are all sorts of implications that we can already see in these first few days of this new administration. But I wonder if a useful thing to do is to look back at previous occasions where you've had supermajorities. You had Bill Clinton, he had a supermajority, although he was nothing like as radical as this administration. Barack Obama, he had a big majority, although again, he had nothing like the agenda that this lot have. And one of the consequences of the Democrats having those strong positions is that it sort of provoked a response. Within 2 years, Bill Clinton found Newt Gingrich came in with a contract with America. Obama, within a couple of years, lost his supermajority. I think the really interesting question is not so much what the Biden administration or the Pelosi administration under the presidency of Biden is going to do. I think the really interesting question is, what are the other lot going to do? Are they going to carry on playing this like they did in Georgia? In which case, I suspect they won't do what Gingrich did with the contract with America. Or are they going to actually rediscover their inner Ronald Reagan? If they rediscover that inner Ronald Reagan and return to the idea of principled conservatism, then I think actually in a couple of years they could cut short the Biden radicals. But it's going to be fascinating to watch. There's never been a more interesting time, I think, to be in America, and I think the need for conservative ideas on the Republican right, Reaganite type republicanism, I think that need is very, very acute today.
Thank you, Douglas. I think there'll be a lot to discuss about the power of the far left of the Democratic Party and what influence they really will have on the Biden administration. Because Biden himself, obviously, is a bit more of a centrist. He's a bit more of a moderate, but will definitely be being pulled in those directions because that seems to be where the momentum is. How Bernie did in the primaries is really indicative of what the Democrat Party kind of is staking their hopes on. So that will be interesting to see as time progresses, especially in 4 years. I'd like to bring in my other guests, and I have a few questions for them before we get to the audience Q&A. So don't forget to submit your questions via the Q&A box below, and we'll get to those in a bit. But Let me start. Freddie, let's get this out of the way, because if any of our guests are consumers of the Americano podcast, they will know that you do not think we are going to return to normalcy. So I want to see if you'd expand on that, if you think that normalcy is a desirable goal for a presidency, for an administration, and what do you think that the tone of the next few years is going to be?
Well, I mean, I realize it has an American history, but I just think normalcy is such an odd word that it sort of speaks to the fact that it's not going to happen. I don't think we're going to see a return to normalcy, because Biden's whole leadership is itself very odd. I mean, I don't want to get into the whole kind of speculation about his mental health and so on, but the fact is he is quite frail. He's done a good job so far with his speech, done an okay job with his speeches so far, but you wouldn't want a very good debater to go up against him. He was lucky in a way that he had Donald Trump in the presidential debates. And it is, people are calling it a regency presidency. There is going to be a bit of this. There's going to be this strange, as I keep saying, zombie-like atmosphere around it, where you don't really know whether it's Pelosi in charge, whether it's Kamala Harris in charge. There'll be a lot of talk about the squad, but I think that's less relevant than a lot of people think. But I think that there will be this this sort of odd sense of not really knowing if the president is in charge and whether he's just delivering remarks from a teleprompter. So I think it will be very, very odd time in America. And I think a lot of people will be getting legislation that they don't really understand, and they certainly didn't vote for, because as Joseph and Douglas said, people didn't really vote for Biden. Most of them were voting because they don't like Donald Trump. And so there's certainly, and I think the reason they voted for Biden, well, the Democrats voted for the Biden in the nomination process, was because he was conspicuously not a radical. But I don't think they realize quite how much throughout his entire life, he's always just sought the middle ground. And if the middle ground has happened to be the middle ground of the Democratic Party, I should add, not the middle ground of the political spectrum. If the middle ground happened to be in the 1990s, let's be tough on crime and lock up lots of African Americans, he was quite happy to do that. Now the middle ground of the Democratic Party is somewhere far different, and he's quite happy to be there.
Yeah, I think I might have heard it on one of your podcasts, but it's not that he's left the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party has left him, almost left him behind as it's progressed.
Yes.
So Douglas, we mentioned it a bit in the introductory statements, but I'd like to hear your opinions on the legislative agenda. So we've got the $1.9 trillion stimulus package that's been proposed. What do you think are the prospects for something like that? How much will it get chipped away at? And how do we feel from a state level about such sweeping influence and kind of the return of big government, which Trump was obviously hesitant to engage in?
Justin Amash, one of my favorite ever American lawmakers, points this out rather brilliantly. And I think it says a lot about the Republican Party that Justin Amash felt the need to leave the Republican Party. But Justin Amash points out with a rare brilliance for a politician the extent to which members of Congress have gradually given up the right to effect change, to amend legislation. And so Congress can only really rubber stamp proposals that are authored elsewhere. And far from being able to deliberate and deconstruct some of the spending proposals, I fear we're going to end up with a situation where big money bills are put before lawmakers who will vote for them on purely party lines without the sort of deliberation that the founding fathers envisaged members of Congress having. And I think it bodes ill. I think you're going to get huge amounts of federal money hosed at supposed social and other supposed problems. It's going to mean that America's next generation but one or two are going to be left with the most almighty fiscal problem. And I'm not really sure that in the short term, there's a lot that small state conservatives can do about it. For one thing, I don't think it's clear to many Republicans that they should be advocating fiscal conservatism. Several years ago, you'll remember there was a movement in America called the Tea Party, and the Tea Party started off with the idea of fiscal responsibility. That was its main issue, and when it stuck to that, it was phenomenally successful. It then veered off into being very outspoken, and some would say obnoxious on a whole bunch of issues, and it lost credibility. But I think somehow the conservative forces within American politics, both within and outside the Republican Party, have to rediscover this idea of fiscal prudence and conservatism. At the moment, there is not really a coherent opposition to what the Democrats are going to want to do. There is not really the means for individual people in Congress to do it. And so I suspect you're going to see a very significant increase in the federal deficit in borrowing. And I think that is not great. However, in politics, as we saw with the Brexit referendum, one event can prompt a strong reaction to it. I think we should be thinking in terms of what do we do to ensure that the pushback against this radicalism, this Pelosi-style radicalism, what do we do to ensure that the pushback against that is coherent and credible and sets out a genuine alternative for the Republic? Because at the moment, politics seems to be a competition between big state angry republicanism and big state woke democratism, and I'm not sure that's really good for anyone.
I mean, Joseph, Joe, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I mean, if I can jump in on this issue of what exactly is normal here. I mean, if people are talking about Biden getting back to normal, because I mean, my take on this is that, I mean, some of the problems that we've been talking about on this panel are actually not new. I mean, the Congress has been neutering itself for quite a long time, and it's also not at all an unusual circumstance in American politics that you have a president elected and very early in his term, you don't have an effective opposition, because usually the opposition party is still licking its wounds and engaging in pretty vicious infighting to try to figure out why it thinks it lost the election. So I think some of these conditions don't strike me as particularly strange in the context of American politics. I mean, what I think is unusual is the nature of the Biden administration itself. And, you know, I think Freddie was kind of hinting at this a bit. The way I would think of it is that it's almost as if America has a prime minister right now instead of a president, because usually a president has been elected on the back of a clearly articulated agenda that the candidate has really gone out there and sold very aggressively to voters so that people know what they're getting right from the start. Whereas what happened in this election is that the paramount goal on the left and on the part apparently of the majority of the electorate was just getting Trump out of office. And so Biden was selected as the candidate and then elected as the president more for his ability to pull together enough of these disparate strands within the Democratic coalition to get them over the finish line in November than because he had an agenda that people were embracing. And so I actually think that a lot of the confusion that we're going to see in the first 100 days and beyond, and then also a lot of this very aggressive push from the progressives is going to be to try to capitalize on this situation while they still have the opportunity before Biden gets, before any other faction within the Democratic Party gets organized to stop anyone, as much as it is that they're trying to run down the clock on this golden age that every new president gets before there's an effective opposition party.
It's interesting. I think what I wanted to address next was what sort of opposition from inside the Democratic Party we can anticipate. He's got a very narrow majority in the House, and it's 50-50 split in the Senate. So he's going to need all of those coalitions on board to get anything done. Do we think that there's going to be any sort of real pushback infighting, or is it going to be kind of just, as long as it's a Democrat policy, it will go through? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Yeah, Joe?
Well, I mean, this is why I think that all of this stuff that's going on with energy right now is so fascinating, because basically what is happening is that you have this situation where Biden didn't win a super majority at this election. I mean, he won the popular vote and he won the electoral vote, but he didn't have any coattails at all, which was also very unusual for a newly elected president. They're tied in the Senate. They lost seats in the House. And in fact, a lot of these House moderates including from states like Pennsylvania, which is a state I know well because my parents live there now, has a big energy industry in the west of the state. And I think that what is happening is that there is an infighting going on within the Democratic caucus in the House about whether they should be paying more attention to the electoral needs of these moderate members who will have to defend some of these energy districts, or are they going to push forward with things like the Green New Deal that is advocated by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who knows how to defend a safe Democratic seat in an urban district and otherwise isn't obviously good at traditional electoral politics. And I think that what's happening is the progressives have decided that they're going to go for it. So I think that a lot of these executives' orders that we're seeing on the Keystone XL pipeline, or I think they're expecting some of the fracking stuff to happen tomorrow, is a manifestation of this progressive wing of the party trying to go really, really fast so that they can steamroll some of their priorities through before their opposition within the moderate wing of their own party manages to mobilize.
I think I'd add to that. I think that's completely right, President. And I think a key factor in the Biden presidency will be how successfully can he juggle, the supposed more conservative senators with his good old boy Washington rep. He's loved in Washington. We hear a lot about Joe Manchin, senator from West Virginia, and I once made the mistake of telling Joe Manchin that I didn't understand why Joe Biden was so popular among Democrats, or had such a lifelong a reputation of being such a great guy and such a great politician, and he looked really offended. And then I realized they're actually best friends, very close buddies, and their wives are very close. And I think that's how Biden gets through Washington, right? People like him. He's incredibly friendly. He jokes about himself, and no one takes him that seriously. But that's how he'll kind of cajole, if you like, the right of the party, if you can talk about a right of the Democratic Party. But the progressive wing are not joking. They're not in the mood for politics as normal and Washington charm. They're in the mood for revolution and transforming the soul of the country and so on. I mean, for old timers like Pelosi, it's always a bit of a con, I think, and so you get this, something like climate change. They'll happily throw trillions of dollars at it. But in terms of actually sort of effecting change on criminal justice, things like that, I'm not sure the old hierarchy of the party is that willing to take things on. So I think it'll be a sort of strange dance of gestures about climate change and a lot of woke stuff, a lot of trans stuff, which again is, I think, not many voters are that concerned about trans rights, but it's already one of the key issues for the Biden administration.
So do we think that there's any sort of hope for this togetherness if we're not sure that Biden can square the own circles within his party, never mind bringing the fractured Republicans on board, especially those who seem to be still clinging to Trump's legacy? What is this potential for togetherness? What even is togetherness at this point? And Douglas, maybe anyone?
I think in a healthy republic, you want to have political competition, and the idea that you should have uniformity of opinion is of itself a problem. But although Biden in that rather, I think Biden has played the role of being a politician for so long that he doesn't just talk in cliche, he thinks in cliche. And one of the cliches you're supposed to do, and it's a cliche we could have done with over the past 4 years, is that the president is supposed to be statesmanlike. And if you're being statesmanlike, you talk about unity. And Biden goes and he does that. He plays the role of the part as you would expect someone to play the role of the part. But when you look at actually what he does, when you look at the executive orders he signs, or when you look at him instructing the federal officials to no longer deport people who've come into the country illegally, he's not doing things that are designed to reach out to the 70+ million people who voted for the other guy. A lot of this stuff is pretty incendiary. And one way of looking at it might well be, as Freddie implies, that the Democrats are trying to get all this stuff out the way quickly, get through it, do what FDR in the 100 Days did, which is get through big change. A lot of it, I fear, is just very woke, identity obsessed politicians doing it to cock a snook at the other tribe, the blue team in DC, enjoying thumbing their nose at what they regard as the deplorables. And I don't think that is any way to create unity. There's nothing Reagan-esque about him. There's nothing Bill Clinton-ish about him. I remember Bill Clinton, and it may be something that people have forgotten, but Bill Clinton was actually an incredibly effective Democrat at appealing to people who may have previously voted for the Republicans. And Clinton was actually pretty moderate, and there were an awful lot of Republicans who actually quite liked Bill Clinton. Whisper it softly and gently, they may have forgotten it today, but they did. There's nothing in terms of this administration's policy priorities that would suggest they're going to do anything other than do what they think they can get away with and what will antagonize and annoy what they regard as yesterday's people and the deplorables. And I fear for the future of political discourse if they carry on doing that, because politics will then become, like it was in late Rome, an intense competition to have monopoly power, and the stakes become very high, and politics is elevated to almost a religion, and that is an incredibly destructive position for any republic to find itself in.
Yeah, I mean,
Joe.
if anything, I think Douglas is maybe a little optimistic about the prospects for unity right now in the U.S. I mean, I think, Douglas, you're absolutely right with your sort of final thought there about how for a lot of segments of the political debate in the US, it has almost come to take the place in people's souls that religious belief used to take. So I think that the problem that we have with de-escalating a lot of these divisions right now is that we are not arguing about sort of the difference between a 21% and a 25% tax rate. And yes, I mean, there are some economic consequences of that. But at the end of the day, a 4 percentage point difference in the tax rate is probably not a moral issue. But increasingly, this stuff feels like it is a moral issue for the people on the both sides who are doing that. And so from that perspective, yes, I mean, it's true that Biden was talking about, used the word unity in his inaugural address, but I actually thought that speech was kind of a train wreck if your goal was to actually unite the country, because his framing of it was, we need to unite behind the forces of good, by which he meant my coalition's policy priorities, against all of the bigots who seek to do us ill. And that is not the way that you talk about people who disagree with you about what the corporate income tax rate should be. And I am concerned that that kind of phenomenon is only going to get worse the deeper into this progressive governance that we get, because people are convinced that a lot of these issues are existential concerns. I think that climate policy is a really good example of that, where it isn't just a matter that it's important you care about the climate, but your spiritual redemption demands that you adopt a specific suite of policies for dealing with climate issues. And that is profoundly unhealthy. And unfortunately, I don't really see a clear path out of that right now.
Going off of what Douglas said earlier about maybe the return to a statesman in the office of the president, one of my longstanding issues with Trump, especially as an American abroad, getting asked my opinion on Trump all the time, was that he wasn't statesman-like. He brought no dignity to the office, in my opinion, and kind of embarrassed us on the national stage a bit. That's my own opinion, but I wonder what we think about Biden as an international statesman. Sure, he is gaffe prone as well, but he's looking to kind of reassert an outward-looking United States rejoining some of these international treaties and organizations. So what do we think Biden has in store for kind of international outward-looking, tying into the special relationship or lack thereof?
Freddie, after you.
Well, I've been getting a bit of flack on Twitter because I wrote a piece and the headline was, "At last, America has a gaffe-prone president again. And I think everybody assumed I was saying that Trump was not gaffe prone. But my point was that Trump was the gaffe, right? The beauty pageant organizer became president. That wasn't meant to happen. But also that he didn't actually make, compared to Biden, he didn't actually make that many verbal slips, whereas Biden does it all the time. And it's the only thing I'm pleased about the Biden administration, because the reason I'm pleased about it is that it's a healthy sign if the president says something stupid and everyone finds that shocking or funny. With Trump, that just stopped happening. So I think well, it did happen, but in a much more sort of sordid way, I think. So I think the thing to be pleased about with Biden is, yes, he will be more statesman-like in international settings, in international relations, and so on. Again, whether that's something to be that excited about, given his gaffe-prone nature and his wandering mind, I'm not sure.
Morgan, it may well be the case that people watching American politics in Europe and around the world find the idea of Biden far more agreeable because he signs up to the Paris this and the Rio summit that and all the rest of it. But I think the really interesting thing is, how will he be perceived amongst ordinary Americans, the people who actually put him where he is? I've been quite struck since I've been in America, which is only sort of 4 weeks now, how many Americans sort of feel a sense of despair about the Republic. And I've sort of said to some of them, for goodness sake, cheer up. The Republic is 240 years old. Whether you like Trump or dislike Trump, whether you like Biden or dislike Biden, it was designed by people who saw people like Trump and Biden coming. Imagine what it would have been like if in the 19th century, when Andrew Jackson had been in the White House, he had Twitter. I mean, he would have tweeted things that would have made Donald Trump seem the height of reserve and polite civic discourse. Imagine what Nixon or LBJ would have been like if they had had social media on their way up the greasy pole. So I don't think people should despair. There's nothing wrong with the Republic. A lot of what we're seeing here is actually what happens to politics in the age of digital engagement. There's an immediacy, so we can see the warts and the all of political players. And I think that's something that, where America leads, the rest of the world will follow. We will no longer look up to politicians as being these remote titans. We'll see them as bad-tempered, middle-aged people who got out of bed the wrong side that morning. But maybe it's a good thing if we stop regarding politicians as great heroic figures who are going to come and solve our problems. Maybe having a healthy contempt for all of them is actually good for us, our sanity and our societies.
Well, I do think that's something to worry about in a Biden administration, is that the sort of the cant about what's appropriate political discourse is getting out of hand. And you're now seeing censorship on social media. And I don't know if you saw Stephanie Murphy's sort of anti-QAnon bill. It didn't say anybody who joins QAnon cannot hold public, or who actively supports QAnon cannot hold public office, which I would have disagreed with anyway. It said anybody who's engaged in conspiracy theories or false information about the government cannot. And I mean, that could be interpreted to mean anything.
Anyone on Facebook.
Anyone on Facebook, yeah. So I think, that is something to be careful of, is that we are now so, particularly after the storming of the Capitol, which was, of course, a shocking, horrifying event.
If you're going to insist that people who engage in false misinformation about the government aren't given airtime, Robert Peston would be taken off air, the BBC would be shut down.
Adam Schiff should probably be hung, drawn, and quartered. But I think, sorry, that's probably not appropriate.
Well, I want to get some time in for some audience questions, but one of the questions we've got submitted already kind of ties on the international relations side. So I don't want to cut you off, but this was a good question that I wanted to ask. So Adam asks, how is the Biden administration going to conduct the trade war with China? So Biden's agreed with Trump on the genocide of the Uyghurs, but will we see a fundamental shift in how the UK interacts with China, trades with China? Or are we going to see a return to the kind of economically engaged with China while hoping that they'll change their ways? Do we see a pending trade war or some harsh sanctions on China over their actions?
Well, my working theory on this is actually that there is going to be a lot more continuity on a lot of foreign policy issues between Trump and Biden than people seem to be assuming there will be. And China is a good example of this. We can potentially talk about some others. And it's because on a lot of this, trade stuff, and then also in terms of America's relationship with countries like China, I think that Trump was perhaps less disruptive himself than he was expressive of a mainstream consensus that existed where kind of the elite circles in Washington had fallen out of step with that. So I think that there had been growing skepticism about America's trading relationship with China for a long time. This was sort of the intellectual error of a lot of the heartburn that we suffered in the 80s about trade with West Germany and Japan that had then morphed into this disquiet about China. Trump was a perfect standard bearer for that because he had been out there beating the drum in trade with Japan in the 80s. And because Trump reflected this emerging consensus among the electorate that was then starting to filter into Congress, I think that you actually will see that a lot of aspects of that perpetuating in China issues. And this could create opportunities for agreement with Republicans in Congress, as surprising as that sounds. I mean, if he wants to, for economic reasons, to do with the Democrats' traditional union base and their efforts to woo those voters back from Trump. If Biden wants to perpetuate a trade war with China, he will find willing Republicans, especially in the Senate, who will join with him to vote on human rights related legislation. So, on a lot of this stuff, I'm not sure that we're going to see a huge difference. I think that there are a few caveats to that. I think that we might actually see, ironically enough, Biden going easier on Russia than the Trump administration did in practice. And then I think that there's also a real danger that for legacy reasons held over from the Obama administration, he's going to undo a lot of the progress that Trump ended up making in the Middle East. But on some of these other issues, don't expect as much change as people might be thinking there will be.
Yeah, one of the interesting questions I had wanted to ask was in regards to, again, the special relationship UK-US trade. What are the prospects when Biden's already come out with a very strong Buy American language? And I think that kind of just reflects, as was mentioned earlier, the links to the traditional trade communities and kind of going back to that blue collar supporting American workers, which if you have tariffs on the other hand, just completely undoes any sort of messaging like that.
Well, and I mean, even on a technical sense, I mean, people in the UK should not be under any illusion that a US-UK trade deal would have been easier in a Trump second term than it will be under Biden, because I mean, what are the sticking points we already were dealing with? We were dealing with these infernal chlorinated chickens, and we were dealing with financial service regulation and mutual market access there. And we were dealing with pharmaceutical procurement and issues to do with the NHS and healthcare in the UK. And then the UK side was fretting about state-by-state insurance regulation in America. Well, all of those issues have always been there. They were there before Trump. They have been negotiating priorities for the US in all of America's trade negotiations around the world for many years in various forms. That was, it was not easy to get over those hurdles under Trump. It was not going to be easy to do in a Trump second term. It's not going to be any easier, and it's also not going to be any harder to do under Biden.
I have a question from my boss, Eamon. He always gets a question, so this is one of his questions. Is there any prospect at all that some future American president might clean up US politics, appointing diplomats, not donors, as ambassadors, stopping gerrymandering, giving up executive orders, being a president for everyone, and a restraint on Congress? And he ends that with, silly question, I know. Do we have a yes or no answer? Is there a hero that's going to clean up politics?
I think yes. Yeah, I think I agree with what Douglas was saying. As America has always been a restless giant. It's always been tumultuous, and hopefully, it always ends up kind of winning and being okay. And I think we may see. I think there's going to be a a pretty devastating few years in American politics. I don't see how polarization ends, but I do think if the right figure comes along I would say on the right, he or she could quite possibly be a kind of unity president, a genuinely unity president, rather than the sort of phony woke unity that we're talking about with Joe Biden.
Morgan, I think if we're looking to a big man or a big woman to enter the White House and renew and restore the republic, we're going to be looking in the wrong place. But I don't think this means we should give up hope. I think there is cause for optimism precisely because of the genius of the Constitution, which gives states the role that they have. I can't help noticing that when the Republican Party chooses former state governors to be their flagship candidates for the presidency, they tend to do great things. And if you look around the US today, there is some phenomenal Republican conservative talent out there. I'm talking about Kristi Noem in South Dakota. I'm talking about the guy in Florida. I mean, our own chap here in Mississippi is pretty good. He wants to scrap income tax. There's an enormous amount of talent out there, but it's at the state level. And I think in policy terms, it's going to be at the state level, organizations like the Mississippi Center for Public Policy, organizations working at state level that will come up with the agenda to renew and to restore the republic. In my adult lifetime, all the great public policy innovations in America have come not from DC, not from the Beltway, but from the states here. Wisconsin welfare reform, energy policy in Texas, tax cuts in Tennessee, charter schools in the Midwest. This is going to be the vehicle to renew and restore the republic. And I think actually there's a huge opportunity. There's great cause for optimism. There's leadership out there, but it's not going to be just a question of trying to parachute the right guy or woman into the White House. It needs to be a states-driven agenda. A contract with America almost coming from the 50 states. I think that's the sort of thing that could do this.
And
Joe, just quickly before we come to you, I have two related questions I'd like to pose to Douglas as a yes or no. Two separate people have asked, do you think any states might secede? So I would like to ask yes or no, do you think we'll see any state secession?
No, I don't. I think the American Republic will be stronger in years to come than it is today, and it's a club to join, not a club to leave.
Right. Joe, sorry for the interruption, but please.
I just wanted to add a coda to this discussion we were having about fixing American politics, just to point out with respect to Eamon that not everything that he mentioned in that question is actually broken. I think that you're actually better off if the US ambassador to your country is a major donor, because that increases the likelihood that the president will pick up the phone when he calls back to Washington. And, that's kind of a cheeky way of making this point that the genius of the American system is that some of the aspects of it that from the outside look like they are the most broken are actually the features that allow it to work the most effectively. And I think that can often be worth keeping in mind when we have these reform discussions.
I think if Trump, can I just add, I think if Trump had been re-elected, I think it wouldn't be absurd to talk about the possibility of California succeeding. But instead, because Biden's been elected, they'll just turn all of America into California instead.
So on the topic of, I know we're just on the first few days of Biden's administration, but if we think this is a placeholder president, what are we looking at in 2024? Who is going to be on the ticket for both parties? Do we have any predictions?
Who says we'll have to wait till 2024? No, I think Kristi Noem is there's a lot of buzz about her on the Republican side. I'll be very interested to see what happens with Pence. Is he regarded now as a traitor by the Trump movement, or did he do the right thing? I think he did the right thing. And then on the Democratic side, Kamala Harris is in prime position. Although, of course, it's almost a shame for her in terms of her career ambition that she's now the deciding vote in a split Senate, because she'll be the face of a lot of controversial legislation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of skeptical about the notion that Kamala Harris is going to have a particularly bright political future after her vice presidential stint, because remember, she was inept enough as a politician that she didn't even make it long enough to get to the first votes in the primary season when she was running for president as a Democrat. And I think that after a certain point, you do have to have that kind of political acumen. And that broadens out to this bigger point about how, what is so unusual now is not that you don't have a clear sense of, who the candidates are likely to be, because we never do. You wouldn't have predicted at this point in 2013 that Trump was going to be the candidate for the Republican Party 4 years later. You wouldn't even have known that he would be a Republican. So I think that you have to leave a high degree of room for accident in American politics, but I think that it is worth remembering that there have been few periods in American history, and particularly in post-war American politics, that have just been as complicated as what we're going through right now. And I think that that is going to place particular demands on any politician who thinks that she or he has a shot of climbing up that greasy pole into the White House. And so I think that you were looking for someone not just who has compelling ideas, but is going to have a almost preternatural political instinct for survival in this kind of environment.
Douglas, do you have any thoughts on the matter?
I'm going to have to tune out in a second, but just to end on an optimistic note, there's a lot of great talent out there. Kristi Noem, DeSantis in Florida, Nikki Haley, Tate Reeves. There's a lot of talent out there, and I suspect the race is on to think not first of all who is the conservative movement's Ronald Reagan. I think the race is on now who's the Newt Gingrich, who's going to come up with the equivalent of the Contract with America that stops stone dead this radicalized extremist Democrat big government agenda, and who is it who's actually going to create a compelling Reagan-esque narrative to get the Republican movement off its knees and make sure that it actually can win in. Frankly, it's got to think in terms of winning in states where it hasn't won in a generation, and it can be done and it must be done, and it's got to stop thinking of politics as being all about demographics. It isn't. And I think one of the great gifts of Donald Trump is in that last election, he pointed, I think, the way to the future. There's nothing inevitable about politics and demography. Actually, you can create a compelling, attractive proposition that wins over all Americans. And I think that is where the Republican movement needs to go.
Great. I think that is a nice note to end on. I'd like to thank all of my guests for their time and effort and their thoughts. I apologize for all of the people that asked questions that we couldn't get to, but if you'd like to continue this conversation on our Facebook page or our Twitter, it is at ASI on Twitter and Adam Smith Institute on Facebook. And we also have 2 upcoming webinars. One is next week with my boss, Eamon Butler, who will be discussing Ayn Rand and her opinions on where we are, what she might have thought of our current situation on the anniversary of her birth. And the next week is my other boss, Madsen Puri, who will be hosting Dr. Anton Howes in a discussion on the power and maybe the saving grace of innovation. So I hope you will tune in, and thank you all so much for joining us.
Been a pleasure, Morgan. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
Freddie. Thank you, Joe.
All the best.
Yep.